I thought this cruise was going to be our family's fresh start after losing Harold, my husband of 42 years. My son Danny and his wife Courtney had insisted on paying for everything, claiming they wanted to help me heal. But when that young waitress named Emma slipped me that crumpled note during dinner, my blood turned to ice water. "Call 911, it said in shaky handwriting. I looked up at Danny laughing loudly at something on his phone, while Courtney snapped photos of our supposedly perfect family dinner, and suddenly everything clicked into place. 3 weeks earlier, my world had crumbled in the span of 24 hours. Harold collapsed in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning, clutching his chest and gasping for air. By Wednesday evening, he was gone, and by Thursday, Danny was sitting in our living room with a stack of papers explaining how he'd handle everything. Mom, you don't need to worry about any of this," Danny had said, his voice dripping with false concern as he spread documents across Harold's favorite coffee table. "I've already contacted the funeral home arranged for the cremation and started the insurance paperwork. You just focus on grieving." Something about his efficiency had unsettled me then, but grief has a way of clouding judgment. Harold and I had been together since I was 23 years old. Losing him felt like losing half my soul, and I welcomed any help that would spare me from dealing with the practical details of death. Courtney had been equally helpful, organizing casseroles from neighbors, fielding sympathy calls, and somehow managing to look perfectly put together, even while playing the role of grieving daughter-in-law. Her designer black dress at the funeral must have cost more than most people's monthly rent, but I'd attributed it to her wanting to look respectful for Harold's service. "We've been thinking," Danny had announced just 5 days after the funeral, "that maybe you need a change of scenery, something to help you process everything that's happened." That's when they'd presented their grand gesture, a 7-day Caribbean cruise, all expenses paid. The brochure showed crystal blue waters, elegant dining rooms, and happy families enjoying tropical sunsets together. "We know how much you and Dad talked about taking a cruise someday." Courtney had added, her manicured fingers touching my arm with practiced sympathy. "We thought this could be a way to honor his memory while giving you time to heal." Their generosity had seemed overwhelming at the time. Danny worked in investment consulting, but I'd never known him to be particularly wealthy. The cruise they'd booked cost nearly $8,000 for our 3-person suite. When I'd questioned the expense, Danny had waved away my concerns. "Business has been really good lately, Mom. Besides, what's the point of success if I can't take care of the people I love?" Now standing on the deck of the Celestial Voyager as we sailed through the Gulf of Mexico, I felt that familiar unease creeping back into my chest. Danny and Courtney moved through the ship like they owned it, greeting staff members by name and navigating corridors with surprising familiarity. "Have you been on this ship before?" I'd asked during our first dinner in the main dining room. "Oh, we've taken a few cruises over the years," Courtney had replied, not quite meeting my eyes. "They all start to feel the same after a while." But it was more than familiarity. It was the way the head waiter had nodded knowingly when Danny requested our specific table, how the bartender had automatically prepared Courtney's complicated cocktail order without being asked, and how Danny seemed to know exactly which deck activities were worth attending. The first 2 days had passed in a blur of forced cheerfulness. Danny kept buying me drinks I didn't want, encouraging me to let loose and have fun. Courtney documented everything with her phone, creating what she called a healing journey photo album for social media. Every smile felt performative, every laugh hollow. It was during our third dinner that the waitress named Emma had approached our table. She was probably in her mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and nervous energy that made her hands shake slightly as she served our appetizers. "How are we enjoying our evening?" she'd asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor that seemed out of place for someone in her profession. Everything's wonderful. Danny had replied without looking up from his phone where he was scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. My mother's having a great time, aren't you, Mom? I'd nodded politely, but something in Emma's expression caught my attention. She was looking at me with an intensity that went beyond professional courtesy, her brown eyes darting between me and my son's preoccupied form. When she'd returned with our main courses, Emma had lingered longer than necessary, refilling water glasses that were still full and rearranging silverware that didn't need adjusting. Courtney was busy staging photos of her salmon for Instagram, complaining that the lighting wasn't flattering enough for her followers. That's when it happened. As Emma leaned over to place my plate in front of me, her hand brushed against mine and I felt a small piece of paper being pressed into my palm. The movement was so subtle that Danny, still absorbed in his phone, and Courtney still posing. Her dinner noticed nothing. The paper felt like fire against my skin. I waited until both Danny and Courtney were distracted before unfolding it carefully under the table. The handwriting was hurried but legible. Call 911. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it across the dining room. I looked up at Emma, who was now standing several tables away, but her eyes found mine immediately. She gave the tiniest nod, so small it could have been mistaken for a natural movement, then turned away to serve another family. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Mom," Danny observed, finally putting down his phone. "Everything okay?" "Just tired." I managed, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "The sea air affects me more than I expected." "You should get some rest after dinner," Courtney suggested, though something in her tone sounded more like an order than a recommendation. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day. We're planning some special activities for you." I tucked the note into my purse and nodded agreement, but my mind was racing. Why would a waitress tell me to call emergency services? What could she possibly know about my situation that I didn't? As we finished dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom, hoping for a chance to think clearly. The corridor leading to the facilities was dimly lit, decorated with maritime paintings that seemed to watch my every step. That's when I heard Danny's voice coming from an alcove near the elevator banks. He was talking quietly on his phone, but the ship's acoustics carried his words clearly. "Everything's going according to plan," he was saying. "The old lady suspects nothing. By the time we dock in 3 days, it'll all be over." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Old lady? That's what my own son had called me. And what exactly would be over in 3 days? I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more, but Danny had moved away from the alcove. When I returned to our table, both he and Courtney were smiling at me with expressions that now seemed sinister rather than caring. "Ready to head back to the room, Mom?" Danny asked, standing up with theatrical concern. "You look a little pale." As we walked through the ship's gleaming corridors toward our suite, I realized that the cruise I'd thought was about healing had become something else entirely. The note in my purse felt like a lifeline, but it also represented a terrifying confirmation that something was very, very wrong with this picture-perfect family vacation. Back in our shared suite, I forced myself to act normally while my thoughts churned like storm clouds. Danny and Courtney were in their adjoining room, and I could hear them talking in low voices through the thin walls. Every instinct told me to listen, but I was afraid of what I might discover. Instead, I focused on my immediate surroundings, trying to understand what had prompted Emma's warning. Our suite was luxurious by any standard, with a private balcony overlooking the moonlit ocean and furnishings that spoke of serious money. Too much money for Danny's supposed investment consulting salary. As I prepared for bed, I noticed small things that hadn't registered before. My toiletries weren't exactly where I'd left them that morning. The zipper on my suitcase was positioned differently than I remembered. Someone had been through my belongings while we were at dinner. My jewelry case, which contained my grandmother's engagement ring and Harold's wedding band, sat undisturbed on the dresser, but the papers I'd packed in my carry-on bag had been subtly rearranged. Harold's death certificate, our joint bank account information, and copies of our insurance policies had all been shifted from their original positions. Why would Danny and Courtney need to examine documents they'd already helped me organize? Sleep was impossible. I lay in the narrow bed listening to the ship's engines humming beneath the waves and trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Around midnight, I heard movement in the corridor outside our suite. Careful footsteps, hushed voices, the soft click of doors opening and closing. I crept to my room's door and peered through the peephole. The hallway appeared empty, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, I noticed something white on the carpet directly outside my door. Another note. My hands trembled as I quietly opened the door and retrieved the folded paper. This message was longer than the first. Your husband didn't die from heart attack. Meet me in the ship's library at midnight tomorrow. Come alone. E. The words hit me like physical blows. Harold hadn't died from a heart attack, but I'd been there when it happened, had seen him collapse, had held his hand in the ambulance as paramedics worked frantically to save him. The doctor at the hospital had explained that massive coronary events were common in men Harold's age, especially those with high-stress careers. But as I forced myself to remember that terrible morning, details emerged that I'd suppressed in my grief. Harold had been acting strangely for several days before his death, mentioning irregularities he'd discovered in our business accounts. He'd scheduled a meeting with our accountant for the day after he died, planning to investigate what he called some concerning discrepancies. Danny had brought Harold coffee that morning, a special blend he claimed would help with his father's stress. Harold rarely drank coffee, preferring tea, but he'd accepted the gesture from his son. Within an hour, he was dead. The terrible possibility that had been lurking in the shadows of my mind finally stepped into the light. What if Harold's death hadn't been natural? What if my son, the child I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, had killed his own father? I spent the rest of the night sitting by my window watching the Caribbean stars reflect on the dark water and trying to convince myself that I was letting grief and paranoia create monsters where none existed. But Emma's note burned in my memory along with Danny's phone conversation about something being over in 3 days. The next morning brought a performance that would have been worthy of Broadway. Danny appeared at my door with fresh coffee and pastries from the ship's bakery, his face arranged in lines of loving concern. "How did you sleep, Mom? You looked pretty worn out last night." "Better than expected." I lied, accepting the coffee while wondering if it contained more than caffeine. The sea air really does help. Courtney emerged from their room in a perfectly coordinated cruise outfit, her phone already in hand, to document another day of our healing journey. She'd posted dozens of photos over the past few days, each one showing our happy family enjoying tropical paradise together. "We have such a fun day planned," she announced, settling next to me on the small sofa. "Danny booked us into that new spa package, and then there's a sunset dinner on the upper deck. You're going to love it." But I noticed she was watching me carefully as she spoke, studying my reactions with the same intensity I'd seen in Emma's eyes the night before. Everyone seemed to be evaluating everyone else, searching for signs of knowledge or suspicion. After they left for what Danny called important business meetings with the ship's activities director, I began my own investigation. Harold had always been methodical about record keeping, and even in my grief I'd maintained his filing system. If there had been irregularities in our accounts, there would be evidence. My laptop was still in my carry-on bag, and I accessed our online banking for the first time since Harold's death. What I found there made my coffee taste like acid in my mouth. Over the past 6 months, there had been a series of transfers from our joint savings account to an account I didn't recognize. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there, but escalating to several $1,000 withdrawals in the weeks before Harold's death. The final transfer for $15,000 had occurred the day after Harold died. The account receiving these funds belonged to Daniel Morrison Financial Services, a company I'd never heard of despite supposedly being married to a successful businessman for over 4 decades. Danny's middle name was Daniel and Morrison was Courtney's maiden name. My son had been systematically stealing from his parents for months, and Harold had apparently discovered the theft just days before his convenient death. But the financial irregularities were just the beginning. As I dug deeper into Harold's computer files, I found browser history that painted an even more disturbing picture. In his final days, Harold had been researching symptoms of poisoning, particularly substances that could mimic heart attack symptoms. He'd bookmarked articles about cardiac glycosides compounds found in certain plants that could cause heart failure in healthy individuals. Harold had suspected he was being poisoned, and he'd been trying to prove it when he died. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. If Danny had killed Harold for money, what was his plan for me? The cruise would end in 3 days, just as Danny had mentioned in his phone conversation. Whatever they intended to accomplish needed to happen before we returned to American soil. I spent the afternoon acting like a grieving widow enjoying her first real vacation in years, but internally, I was planning my survival. The library meeting with Emma was still 12 hours away, but I couldn't wait that long to start protecting myself. During dinner that evening, I paid close attention to everything I ate and drank. Danny continued his pattern of encouraging me to try the wine to celebrate Dad's memory, with champagne to live a little, with exotic cocktails. Each time, I found excuses to decline or managed to pour drinks into potted plants when he wasn't looking. Courtney's photography had become even more intensive, documenting every moment of our dinner with the dedication of a professional photojournalist. But she wasn't just taking pictures for social media anymore. She was creating a visual record of my supposedly happy final days evidence that would support whatever story they planned to tell about my fate. "You should try the chocolate cake," Danny insisted when dessert arrived. "Dad always said you had a sweet tooth." The cake looked delicious, rich, and decadent, but I claimed to be too full to enjoy it properly. Danny's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance before returning to its mask of filial devotion. As we prepared to leave the dining room, I noticed Emma working across the restaurant. Our eyes met briefly, and she nodded almost imperceptibly toward the upper decks. The library meeting was still hours away, but she was confirming that it was still happening. Walking back to our suite, I realized that I was no longer just a grieving widow on a healing cruise. I was a woman fighting for her life against people who were supposed to love and protect her. The next 24 hours would determine whether I joined Harold in death or found a way to bring his killers to justice. The ocean stretched endlessly around our ship, dark and vast, and indifferent to human suffering. But somewhere in that darkness, I was going to find the strength to fight back against the 2 people who had destroyed my family and stolen my future. The ship's library was located on Deck 8, tucked away behind the main theater and art auction gallery. During the day, it buzzed with passengers browsing vacation reading and children attending story time. But at midnight, it became a cavern of shadows and silence illuminated only by small reading lamps scattered throughout the space. I'd spent the evening pretending to be exhausted, claiming I needed early rest to prepare for tomorrow's shore excursion in Cozumel. Danny and Courtney had exchanged a look that I now recognized as communication about their timeline, but they'd wished me good night with apparent sincerity. Waiting until I heard their soft snores through the adjoining wall, I slipped out of my room at 11:45 and made my way through the ship's corridors. The celestial voyager never truly slept, but the late-night crowd was concentrated in the casino and nightclub areas. The library deck was virtually deserted. Emma was waiting for me in the biography section, her waitress uniform replaced by jeans and a sweatshirt that made her look even younger than I'd initially thought. She gestured for me to follow her deeper into the stacks, away from the main entrance and any security cameras. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, settling into a reading nook surrounded by shelves of travel guides. "I wasn't sure you'd trust me enough to show up." "I'm not sure I do trust you," I replied honestly. "But something is very wrong with this situation, and you seem to be the only person who's noticed." Emma's expression was grave as she pulled out a tablet computer and opened a file folder. "Mrs. Morrison, my name isn't really Emma, and I'm not actually a cruise ship waitress. I'm Jessica Martinez, and I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The world seemed to tilt around me. "The FBI. What does the FBI want with a family cruise?" "We've been investigating a series of suspicious deaths aboard various cruise lines over the past 2 years," Jessica explained, swiping through documents on her screen. "Elderly passengers with significant assets who die in apparent accidents or from natural causes while traveling with younger family members who inherit everything." She showed me a photograph of an older woman standing on a ship's deck, smiling at the camera with the same forced cheerfulness I'd been displaying for the past 3 days. "This is Margaret Morrison, age 73, who died 6 months ago during a river cruise in Europe. She fell overboard during rough weather and her body was never recovered." My heart stopped. Margaret Morrison was Harold's sister, the woman who'd helped raise me during my early marriage and who'd been like a second mother to Danny. She died while traveling with Danny and Courtney, and I'd been too wrapped up in planning her memorial service to question the circumstances. "We have financial records showing that Margaret's death resulted in a $400,000 inheritance that went directly to your son," Jessica continued. "And she wasn't the first." The tablet screen filled with more photos, more names, more stories of elderly people who died while traveling with Danny and Courtney. An uncle in Alaska who'd fallen through ice during a fishing expedition. A family friend who'd suffered a heart attack during a hiking trip in Colorado. Harold's business partner who died in a car accident after a weekend getaway to Las Vegas. 7 people in total over the past 3 years, all of them with substantial assets and connections to Danny Morrison. "Your husband wasn't supposed to die yet," Jessica explained. "Our investigation suggests that Harold discovered the pattern and was preparing to expose everything. His death appears to have been moved up to prevent him from going to the authorities." I thought about Harold's research into poisoning symptoms, his scheduled meeting with our accountant, his growing suspicion about Danny's lifestyle and expenditures. He'd been closing in on the truth when his coffee was poisoned that Tuesday morning. "So what's the plan for me?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Jessica's expression darkened. "Tomorrow night there's supposed to be a severe storm system moving through the area. High winds, rough seas, reduced visibility. The perfect conditions for an elderly woman to accidentally fall overboard while taking some air on her balcony." The casual way she described my planned murder made bile rise in my throat. Danny and Courtney had brought me on this cruise specifically to kill me, timing it to coincide with weather that would make my death look natural and my body unrecoverable. "How do you know all this?" I demanded. "If you've been investigating for 2 years, why haven't you arrested them already?" "Because we need evidence that will hold up in federal court," Jessica replied. Cruise ships operate in international waters, which complicates jurisdiction issues. We need recordings, documents, testimony that proves premeditation and conspiracy, and we need to catch them in the act. She handed me a device that looked like a small hearing aid. This is a digital recorder with a range of about 20 feet. We need you to get them talking about their plans about Harold's death, about the other murders. Can you do that? The weight of the recorder in my palm felt enormous. Jessica was asking me to risk my life by confronting two people who'd already killed at least 8 times and who were planning to add my name to their list tomorrow night. What if they realize what I'm doing? What if they decide to kill me earlier than planned? We have agents positioned throughout the ship, Jessica assured me. You'll never be completely alone with them, and if something goes wrong, we have contingency plans to extract you. But even as she spoke, I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Law enforcement training could only do so much on a ship in the middle of the ocean, with limited backup and communication options. There's something else you need to know, Jessica added reluctantly. The ship's security chief, Captain Rodriguez, has been receiving payments from your son for the past year. We're not sure how many other crew members might be involved in covering up these deaths. So even the ship's official safety systems were compromised. I was truly alone in this floating nightmare, surrounded by people who either wanted me dead or were being paid to look the other way when it happened. Why should I trust you? I asked. How do I know you're not part of this scheme? Jessica pulled out her FBI credentials and badge, then showed me text messages between her and other agents coordinating the investigation. Because if I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it days ago. And because you're running out of time to save yourself. She was right. In less than 20 hours, Danny and Courtney planned to throw me overboard and claim it was a tragic accident during rough weather. My choices were to trust this young FBI agent or accept that my life was going to end on a cruise ship balcony while my son watched. What do I need to do? I asked. Jessica smiled for the first time since I'd met her, and it transformed her entire face. Tomorrow you need to be the grieving widow who's finally ready to talk about the future. Ask Danny about financial planning, about what happens to Harold's estate, about how you'll manage without him. Get them talking about money, about inheritance, about how they're planning to help you adjust to life alone. The plan was simple but terrifying. I would wear the recording device during our final day together and try to get my son and daughter-in-law to incriminate themselves while discussing my imminent death. What happens after I get the recordings? We arrest them when the ship docks in Miami the day after tomorrow, Jessica replied. But first we have to make sure you survive tomorrow night. As I made my way back to my suite in the early hours of morning, I realized that my entire understanding of my family had been built on lies and manipulation. The son I'd raised and loved was a serial killer who viewed me as nothing more than a financial opportunity. The daughter-in-law I'd welcomed into our home was an accomplice to murder who'd been planning my death since the day she married into our family. But I wasn't going to die quietly on that balcony tomorrow night. Harold deserved justice. Margaret deserved justice, and all the other victims whose lives had been stolen deserved to be remembered as more than just stepping stones to Danny and Courtney's wealth. I was going to fight back with every ounce of strength and cunning I possessed, and I was going to make sure that my son's killing spree ended with his own destruction. Wednesday morning arrived with deceptively beautiful sunshine and calm seas that gave no hint of the storm system approaching from the east. I woke up feeling more alert and focused than I had since Harold's death, fueled by rage and determination rather than grief and confusion. Danny knocked on my door at 7:30 sharp, carrying his usual offering of coffee and pastries. This time I was ready for him. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, accepting the coffee cup while making sure my fingers didn't actually touch the liquid. "You're so thoughtful to bring me breakfast every day." "Anything for my mom?" he replied. but I caught him watching carefully as I raised the cup toward my lips. When I pretended to take a sip and then set it aside, claiming it was too hot, something flickered across his expression. The coffee smelled normal, but Jessica had warned me that the substances they were using to keep me disoriented were tasteless and odorless. For the past 3 days, I'd been consuming low doses of sedatives that explained my emotional fog and physical lethargy. "I've been thinking about what you said about planning for the future," I told Danny as he settled into the chair across from my bed. "Maybe it's time we talked seriously about finances and what happens next." Danny's entire demeanor shifted, becoming more attentive and focused. "Of course, Mom. I know it's hard to think about practical things when you're grieving, but it's important to be prepared." I activated the recording device Jessica had given me, disguised as a small brooch on my nightgown. "Harold always handled our investments and business accounts. I'm not even sure what assets we have anymore." "Well, there's the house, which is worth about $600,000 in the current market." Danny began pulling out his phone to reference what appeared to be detailed financial notes. "Dad's life insurance policy will pay out $800,000, and there's roughly $400,000 in various retirement and savings accounts. Nearly $2 million total. More than enough motive for murder, especially when multiplied across multiple victims over several years." "That seems like a lot of money to manage," I said carefully. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "That's why you have me," Danny replied with a smile that no longer looked loving to my educated eyes. "I've already been handling most of the financial transitions since Dad died. It's probably easier if I just continue managing everything for you." Courtney appeared in the doorway, freshly showered and dressed in another expensive outfit that raised questions about their actual income sources. "Good morning, Liza. How are you feeling today?" "Better than I have in weeks," I replied honestly. Danny was just explaining how he's been handling all the financial details since Harold passed. "I'm so grateful to have such responsible children." Courtney's smile was sharp around the edges. "We just want what's best for you. Managing money and investments can be so stressful for someone who's dealing with loss." "Speaking of stress," Danny added, "we should probably talk about updating your will and beneficiary information. Just to make sure everything's organized properly." The recording device felt like it was burning against my chest as I realized they were discussing my estate planning while simultaneously planning my death. "What kind of changes do you think I should make?" "Well, since it'll just be you now, it makes sense to simplify things," Danny explained. "Maybe set up a trust that I can manage with instructions for how you want assets distributed eventually." Eventually, as in after tomorrow night when my body disappeared beneath Caribbean waves. "That sounds complicated," I said. "What if something happened to me before we got everything organized?" Danny and Courtney exchanged a quick look that the recording device wouldn't capture, but that spoke volumes about their coordination. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Mom," Danny said with false reassurance. "But if something unexpected did occur, you'd want to make sure your wishes were clear. Maybe we should set up a simple will that leaves everything in trust for eventual distribution to family members." Family members meaning Danny, since I had no other living relatives after Margaret's convenient death 6 months earlier. "What about Harold's business?" I asked. "Morrison Plumbing Supply has been our main source of income for 30 years. I've already been working with the lawyers to dissolve the business and liquidate the assets," Danny replied. "It's too much for you to manage alone, and frankly, the plumbing supply industry isn't what it used to be." This was news to me. Harold's business had been thriving when he died, with contracts extending well into the following year, and a loyal customer base built over decades. Dissolving it would eliminate hundreds of thousands of dollars in ongoing revenue, but it would also convert everything into liquid assets that could be more easily stolen. "When did you start the dissolution process?" I asked. "Right after the funeral." Courtney answered quickly. We didn't want to burden you with business decisions while you were grieving. So they'd been dismantling my financial life for 3 weeks, positioning themselves to inherit everything while making it look like concerned family members helping a confused widow. You've both been so helpful, I said, making my voice wobble slightly with emotion. I don't know what I would have done without you these past few weeks. That's what family is for, Danny replied, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that now felt like a predator marking territory. We're going to take care of you for as long as you need us. For as long as you need us, which according to their timeline was approximately 16 more hours. After they left to finalize some cruise activities, I sat in my cabin reviewing everything I'd recorded and planning my next moves. The device had captured their discussion of my assets, their admission that they'd been making financial decisions without my knowledge or consent, and their obvious coordination in managing my affairs. But I needed more than financial fraud evidence. I needed proof of murder, proof of their plans for tomorrow night, proof that would expose the entire scope of their crimes. Jessica had given me a second recording device, this one disguised as a pen that I could carry more openly. She'd also provided pills that looked identical to the sedatives they'd been giving me, but were actually harmless placebos. My job for the rest of the day was to appear increasingly confused and disoriented while actually becoming more alert and focused. The hardest part was pretending to grieve for Harold, while knowing that his death had been a calculated murder committed by our own son. Every time Danny touched my arm or Courtney offered sympathy, I wanted to scream at them about what they'd stolen from me. Not just Harold's life, but 42 years of marriage, decades of shared dreams and plans, and quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee together. They'd stolen my future as surely as they'd stolen my past, and tomorrow night they planned to steal my life itself. But I wasn't the confused, medicated widow they thought they were manipulating. I was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Harold's memory. Margaret's memory, the memories of all their victims demanded justice. And I was going to deliver it even if it killed me in the process. Thursday dawned with ominous gray clouds gathering on the horizon and winds that made the ship's movement more pronounced. The weather reports confirmed Jessica's information about the incoming storm system, with conditions expected to deteriorate significantly after sunset. Perfect cover for an accidental death, just as Danny and Courtney had planned. I spent the morning playing my role as an increasingly confused widow, asking repeated questions about our schedule and expressing anxiety about the rough seas. Danny was especially attentive, offering me additional medication for seasickness that I pretended to take while actually palming the pills. The ship's doctor says these should help with the nausea, he explained, handing me 2 small white tablets. They might make you a little drowsy, but you'll feel much more comfortable. Drowsy enough to offer no resistance when they dragged me to the balcony later, no doubt. You're so good to me, I replied, making my voice slightly slurred as if the fake medication was already taking effect. I don't know why I've been feeling so scattered lately. It's normal after losing someone you love, Courtney said with practiced sympathy. Grief affects everyone differently, and sometimes it takes months to feel like yourself again. By which time I'd be dead and they'd be collecting life insurance proceeds while telling everyone how tragic it was that poor Liza never recovered from losing Harold. Around noon, as we sailed through increasingly choppy seas toward our final port of call, I managed to position myself near their cabin door while they thought I was napping. The recording pen picked up fragments of their conversation through the thin walls. It has to look natural. Storm will provide perfect cover. Body won't surface for weeks, if ever. Inheritance procedures start immediately when we dock. The casual way they discussed my murder while planning their financial future made my stomach revolt. These weren't crimes of passion or desperate circumstances. They were business transactions, calculated investments in lifestyle enhancement, funded by the systematic elimination of family members. That afternoon, Danny suggested we spend time on our suite's private balcony, claiming the fresh air would help with my seasickness. The balcony was on deck 7, high enough above the water that a fall would be instantly fatal. The railing was 42 inches high, easily cleared by 2 people working together to lift a disoriented victim. "The sunset should be beautiful tonight, even with the storm coming," Danny said as we stood at the railing. "Dad always loved watching sunsets over the ocean." He did. I agreed, gripping the railing and noting how easy it would be for someone to tip over it if they weren't prepared. He used to say that sunsets reminded him that every day was a gift. "Maybe we should have a memorial drink for him tonight," Courtney suggested. "Something special to honor his memory on our last night of the cruise. A memorial drink, probably loaded with enough sedatives to make me unconscious before they carried me to the balcony." They'd practiced this routine enough times with other victims to have perfected their technique. "That sounds lovely," I replied, swaying slightly as if the ship's motion was affecting me more than usual. "I think Harold would like that." Around 4 o'clock, as the storm clouds moved closer and the ship's movement became more dramatic, I received a text message on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. "Emergency procedures in effect tonight. Stay alert. Jay." Jessica was confirming that FBI agents were positioned and ready for whatever happened next, but she was also warning me that the most dangerous part of our plan was about to begin. Dinner was an elaborate affair in our suite, with room service delivering what Danny called a special meal to celebrate Mom's healing journey. The champagne was expensive, the food was perfectly prepared, and everything was calculated to create a final memory of family togetherness before my tragic accident. I ate sparingly and managed to dispose of most of my drinks by pouring them into the ice bucket when Danny and Courtney were distracted by their phones. Both of them seemed nervous, checking the time repeatedly and exchanging meaningful looks when they thought I wasn't watching. "The storm's really picking up out there," Courtney observed as wind howled outside our windows and rain began pelting the glass. "Maybe we should stay inside tonight." "Actually," Danny said, "I think Mom would enjoy seeing the storm from the balcony. It's really quite spectacular when you're safe behind the railing." Safe behind the railing. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "I don't want Liza to get hurt," Courtney added with false concern. "These conditions look dangerous." "We'll be very careful," Danny assured her. Just a few minutes to appreciate the power of nature. Something Dad would have loved to see. The performance was seamless, each of them playing their role in establishing concern for my safety while setting up the circumstances for my death. Anyone reviewing security footage later would see a loving family taking reasonable precautions while enjoying their final night together. As 8 o'clock approached, Danny suggested we move to the balcony for our memorial toast to Harold. The wind was howling now, and rain was coming down in sheets that would make visibility nearly impossible. Perfect conditions for an accident that no one would witness. "Let me get the champagne," Danny said, returning from the kitchenette with a bottle and 3 glasses. "This is a 25-year-old Dom Perignon. Dad would have appreciated the quality." The champagne in my glass looked normal, but I was certain it contained enough sedatives to incapacitate me within minutes. As we moved toward the balcony door, I activated both recording devices and prepared for the performance of my lifetime. "To Harold," Danny said, raising his glass as we stepped into the storm. "A loving husband, devoted father, and successful businessman who provided for his family until the very end." "To Harold," Courtney echoed. "Who would want his wife to be well taken care of by people who love her?" "To Harold," I said, raising my glass but not drinking. "Who always said that family comes first no matter what." The wind was so strong I could barely stand upright, and the rain soaked through my clothes within seconds. Danny moved closer to me ostensibly to offer support, but I could see the calculation in his eyes as he evaluated angles and timing. "It's getting pretty rough out here," he shouted over the storm. "Maybe you should step closer to the railing where there's a little more shelter." The railing that would provide the perfect leverage for throwing me overboard. "Actually," I shouted back, "I think I'd like to go back inside. This is a little too intense for me." Danny's expression flickered with frustration, but he nodded and guided me toward the door. Once inside, I collapsed into a chair and made a show of being shaken by the experience. "That was terrifying," I gasped. The ship was moving so much I felt like I might fall right over the side. "You were perfectly safe," Courtney assured me. "We never would have let anything happen to you." But I could see the communication passing between them. The storm was too perfect to waste, and they needed to find another way to get me back onto that balcony in a more vulnerable state. "I think I need some of that medication Danny got from the ship's doctor," I said, making my voice weak and shaky. "I'm feeling really anxious about being so close to the edge like that." Danny practically leaped up to get the pills, his eagerness barely concealed. "Of course, Mom. Let me get you something stronger to help you relax." This was it. The moment when they would give me enough drugs to make me helpless, then carry me back outside for my final scene. I had to be ready to fight for my life while appearing to be unconscious. As Danny returned with a handful of pills and a glass of water, I realized that the next few minutes would determine whether I lived to see Harold's killers brought to justice or joined him as another victim of their greed and calculation. The storm raged outside, providing the perfect soundtrack for murder, while inside our luxurious suite, my son prepared to complete his most personal kill yet. Danny returned with 4 small white pills and a glass of water, his hands steady despite the ship's violent rocking in the storm. "These are stronger than what you took earlier," he explained with manufactured concern. "The doctor said they'll help with both the seasickness and the anxiety." 4 pills meant they wanted me completely unconscious this time, helpless as they carried me to the balcony for my final performance. I accepted them with trembling fingers, making sure the recording devices captured every detail of this moment. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, bringing the pills toward my mouth while using sleight of hand I'd perfected as a young mother, hiding vegetables in Danny's food. "I just want this awful feeling to go away." I pretended to swallow the pills while actually palming them, then drank the water to sell the illusion. Within minutes, I would need to begin acting increasingly drowsy and disoriented, while actually remaining alert enough to fight for my life. "Why don't you lie down for a few minutes?" Courtney suggested, helping me toward the small sofa. "Let the medication work while we clean up from dinner." I settled onto the cushions and closed my eyes, listening to their hushed conversation as they moved around the suite. The storm outside was reaching its peak intensity, with thunder that shook the ship's structure and lightning that illuminated our windows in stark, dramatic flashes. "How long before those pills take effect?" Courtney whispered to Danny near the kitchenette. 20 to 30 minutes for complete sedation," he replied quietly. "But we should wait until she's fully under before we move her. Can't have her fighting back like Margaret did." Margaret. Harold's sister who'd supposedly fallen overboard during rough weather 6 months ago. The confirmation that she'd fought for her life made bile rise in my throat, but it also strengthened my resolve to survive what they'd planned for me. "What's our timeline?" Courtney asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Security patrol changes at 9:15, Danny answered. "We'll have a 15-minute window with no official presence on this deck, long enough to stage the accident and establish our alibi in the main lounge." An alibi. They'd already planned where to be when my body was discovered missing, probably sitting in a crowded public area, looking appropriately concerned when someone noticed that Liza Morrison wasn't answering her door. I forced my breathing to become deeper and more regular, mimicking the pattern of someone falling into drugged sleep. Every few minutes, I let out a small sigh or shifted positions, slightly selling the performance while straining to hear more details of their plan. "We need to be careful about the physical evidence," Courtney was saying. "No bruises, no signs of a struggle. It has to look like she got disoriented from the medication and wandered outside alone." "The storm will wash away any forensic evidence anyway," Danny replied. "And with the ship rocking this much, even a sober person could lose their balance near the railing." They had clearly practiced this conversation, refined it through multiple murders, until every detail was calculated to avoid detection. I wondered how many other families had trusted these two killers, how many other victims had died believing their loved ones cared for them. At 9 o'clock, Danny checked his watch and nodded to Courtney. "Time to move her. Remember, we need to position her hands on the railing to show she was conscious when she fell." They approached the sofa where I lay, pretending to be unconscious, and I felt Danny's hands slide under my arms while Courtney lifted my legs. The casual way they handled my supposedly unconscious body told me they'd done this before, probably with Margaret and other victims who'd trusted them enough to accept drugged drinks. "She's completely out," Danny observed with satisfaction. "This is going to be even easier than planned." They carried me toward the balcony door, struggling slightly with the ship's movement, but managing to maintain their grip. As we reached the threshold, I made my decision. I couldn't wait for Jessica's backup or hope that FBI agents would intervene in time. If I was going to survive the next few minutes, I had to fight back now. "Actually," I said, opening my eyes and looking directly at Danny's shocked face, "I'm not quite as unconscious as you thought." Danny nearly dropped me in surprise, his confident expression crumbling into confusion and panic. "Mom, how are you?" "Awake, alert, still alive." I completed his question as I struggled free from their grip and backed away from the balcony door. "Because I didn't actually swallow your little murder pills, Danny. Just like I haven't been drinking your drugged coffee or eating your poisoned food for the past 2 days. Courtney's face went white with realization. "She knows. Danny, she knows everything." "I know that you killed Harold," I said, pulling out the recording pen so they could see it clearly. "I know you killed Margaret 6 months ago. I know about all the other murders you've committed while playing loving family members." Danny's shock was rapidly transforming into cold calculation. "How long have you known?" "Since I started connecting the dots about Harold's death and your sudden financial improvements. Since I found the records showing you've been stealing from us for months. Since I realized that Harold died right after he discovered your theft." "You can't prove any of that," Courtney said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can," I replied, backing further into the suite, while keeping both recording devices visible. "I have evidence of your financial fraud recordings of you discussing tonight's murder plan and documentation of the other suspicious deaths you've caused." The storm outside seemed to pause for a moment, as if nature itself was holding its breath to hear what would happen next. In that brief silence, I could hear the ship's engines and the distant sound of other passengers enjoying their evening entertainment, oblivious to the life and death struggle happening in our suite. "You're going to give us those recordings," Danny said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, threatening, completely devoid of the warmth I'd associated with my son for 35 years. "I'm not giving you anything," I replied firmly. "I'm going to watch you pay for what you did to Harold, to Margaret, and to all the others." Danny lunged toward me, but the ship's movement threw him off balance and sent him stumbling into the coffee table. Courtney moved to block the suite's exit, trapping me between them and the balcony door that led to my planned death. "You don't understand, Mom," Danny said, recovering his footing and advancing more carefully. We've put too much work into this to let you ruin everything now." "Work?" I laughed bitterly. "You call murdering your own family work?" "Building a financial future requires sacrifices," Courtney said with chilling calm. "Some people are more valuable dead than alive." The casual cruelty of her statement hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a business model built on the systematic elimination of elderly family members for profit. "Harold loved you," I said to Danny, hoping to reach some remnant of the child I'd raised. "He was so proud of you, so excited about your success. How could you poison your own father?" "He was going to expose us," Danny replied without emotion. "The old man got suspicious about some financial irregularities and was planning to involve the authorities. We couldn't let that happen." "So you killed him with cardiac glycosides in his morning coffee." Danny's eyes narrowed. "You have been busy. Did you figure that out all by yourself, or did someone help you?" Before I could answer, the suite door burst open, and Jessica Martinez stepped through, followed by two men in FBI windbreakers. All three had their weapons drawn and pointed at Danny and Courtney. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Jessica announced. "Daniel Morrison and Courtney Morrison, you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud." But Danny wasn't finished fighting. Instead of surrendering, he grabbed a champagne bottle from the table and swung it at Jessica's head. She ducked, but the movement gave Courtney an opportunity to rush toward me and the balcony door. "If we can't have the money, nobody gets to walk away from this," Courtney screamed, tackling me toward the open door and the railing beyond. The storm had been waiting for this moment, welcoming us onto the balcony with wind that threatened to lift us off our feet and rain that made every surface treacherously slippery. Courtney's weight carried us both toward the railing, her hands clawing at my clothes as she tried to push me over the edge. But 42 years of marriage to Harold had taught me something about fighting for what mattered most. I wasn't the confused, helpless widow they'd been manipulating. I was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by surviving. I grabbed Courtney's hair and yanked her backward, using her own momentum to send her sprawling across the wet balcony deck. Before she could recover, I heard gunshots from inside the suite, and Danny's voice raised in pain and surrender. "It's over, Courtney," I called out over the storm. "Danny's been arrested and everything you've done has been recorded." But Courtney wasn't ready to accept defeat. She struggled to her feet and made one final desperate lunge toward me, screaming about money and inheritance and how I'd ruined everything. I stepped aside at the last moment, and Courtney's momentum carried her straight into the railing. She hit the barrier hard, flipped over it, and disappeared into the churning darkness below with a scream that was swallowed by thunder. For a moment, I stood alone on the balcony in the storm, staring down at the black water where my daughter-in-law had vanished. Then Jessica was beside me, pulling me back into the safety of the suite, where Danny sat handcuffed and bleeding from a shoulder wound. "Are you hurt?" Jessica asked, checking me for injuries while FBI agents secured the scene. "I'm alive," I replied, which seemed like the most important thing in the world at that moment. Harold's been avenged. 6 months later, I stood in a Miami courthouse listening to the judge sentence Danny Morrison to life without parole for the murders of Harold Morrison, Margaret Morrison, and 6 other victims whose deaths had been systematically planned and executed over a 3-year period. The evidence had been overwhelming. The recordings I'd made on the ship, combined with financial records and FBI surveillance footage, painted a clear picture of a conspiracy that had netted Danny and Courtney nearly $2 million from murdered family members and friends. The defendant showed a callous disregard for human life in pursuit of financial gain. Judge Richardson stated as Danny stood impassively before the bench. His victims trusted him as a family member, making his crimes particularly heinous and deserving of the maximum penalty available under law. Danny never looked at me during the sentencing hearing. His lawyer had attempted to argue that Courtney had been the mastermind behind the murders, but the evidence clearly showed equal participation in planning and executing the crimes. The fact that Courtney had died during the attempted murder meant that Danny would bear full responsibility for their partnership in evil. I felt no satisfaction in watching my son receive his punishment, only a hollow sense that justice had finally been served for Harold and the others. The boy I'd raised and loved had died years ago, replaced by a stranger who saw family members as financial opportunities rather than human beings. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse with Jessica Martinez, who had become more than an FBI agent to me over the past months. She'd become a friend, one of the few people who understood what I'd survived and how it had changed me. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we stood in the Miami sunshine, free from the institutional coldness of the courtroom. "Different," I replied honestly. "I'm not the same person who boarded that cruise ship 6 months ago. That woman was naive enough to trust people just because they shared her DNA. The financial recovery had taken months of legal work, but Harold's stolen assets had been returned along with substantial damages from the cruise line for their security failures. I was wealthier than I'd ever been, but money felt less important now than it had when Harold was alive to share it with me. "What will you do now?" Jessica asked. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. The house in Ohio held too many memories of Harold and too much pain from Danny's betrayal. I needed a fresh start somewhere that wasn't haunted by the life I'd lost. "I'm moving to San Diego," I told her. "I found a small house near the ocean close enough to hear the waves, but far enough from cruise ship ports to feel safe." "That sounds perfect for a new beginning." "I'm also starting a foundation," I added. "The Harold Morrison Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention. Too many families have been destroyed by people who see elderly relatives as financial opportunities rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect." Jessica smiled with genuine warmth. "Harold would be proud of that legacy." "I hope so. I want his death to prevent other deaths, to protect other families from going through what we experienced." The foundation had already begun its work partnering with law enforcement agencies to train investigators in recognizing patterns of elder financial abuse and murder. I'd testified before Congress about the need for better oversight of cruise ship safety and reporting requirements for suspicious deaths in international waters. The work gave my grief purpose and transformed my pain into something constructive rather than destructive. Every family we helped protect felt like a small victory for Harold's memory. "Will you stay in touch?" Jessica asked as we prepared to part ways. "Try to keep me away," I replied with a laugh that felt good after months of sorrow and anger. "You saved my life, Jessica. That creates a bond that doesn't break easily." As I drove away from the courthouse toward my new life in California, I thought about the lessons I'd learned during those terrible days on the Celestial Voyager. Trust must be earned through actions rather than given freely because of relationships. Family bonds created by blood can be broken by greed, but chosen families built on mutual respect and shared values prove stronger than any genetic connection. I'd lost Harold, but I'd gained an understanding of my own strength and resilience that would serve me well in the years ahead. The woman who'd boarded that cruise ship as a grieving widow had been rescued by the woman who'd fought back against her would-be killers and emerged victorious. 6 months after Harold's murder, I was finally ready to start living again instead of merely surviving. The ocean outside my new home reminded me daily that storms pass and calmer waters always return for those strong enough to weather the tempest. I'd survived the worst storm of my life and emerged with my integrity and dignity intact. Harold would have been proud of the woman I'd become in the aftermath of his death, and that knowledge gave me peace as I began the next chapter of my story. The Harold Morrison Foundation continues to grow, protecting elderly Americans from the kind of predatory family members who had destroyed my world but failed to destroy my spirit. Every life we save honors Harold's memory and proves that love is stronger than greed, that justice is more powerful than deception, and that sometimes the most ordinary people find extraordinary courage when everything they care about is threatened. I learned that family isn't defined by blood relationships, but by the willingness to protect and care for one another without expecting anything in return. I learned that trust is a precious gift that should be carefully given, and that betrayal by those closest to us can either destroy us or make us stronger depending on how we choose to respond. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to fight back, to demand justice, and to transform tragedy into triumph through courage, determination, and the refusal to accept that evil will prevail over good. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to question someone close to you when their actions didn't match their words? What signs made you realize that someone you trusted might not have your best interests at heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about protecting ourselves and our loved ones from those who would exploit our trust. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who might benefit from hearing it, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories of survival and justice, and share it with others who understand that sometimes the greatest battles are fought within our own families. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to justice, from vulnerability to strength, from grief to healing. Remember that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more resilient than any challenge life can present. Until next time, trust your instincts, protect your heart, and never forget that justice delayed is not always justice denied.